Yes, Lalitji, please.
Keynote speaker for the evening, Mr. G.N. Bajpai, ex-chairman SEBI and LIC. Our panelist, Mr. Prasad Chandran, ex-CMD Basaf Limited. Bhavna Doshi ma'am, past president IMC. Ms. Amita Katragada, partner Cyril Amarchand. Mr. Dhanpal Javeri, vice chairman Everstone. Moderator Jangu Dalal, managing director Intuit Consulting. I welcome all of you in this August gathering, wherein the program has been designed especially keeping in mind the effect of this COVID to the larger business community. At the outset, let me thank Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry for being so kind and effortful in coming out with such a great idea, brilliant idea, and coming and bringing on board all the experts on the subjects so that we can bring the best of the things and the best of the inputs in this particular session. The session for the evening is Board of Directors as a Custodian of Sustainability in the post-COVID-19 world. When we talk about sustainability as of now, really practically speaking, it seems very difficult for at least a year's time, wherein the business community is really responsible and answerable to various stakeholders at various levels. But I feel so with the joint efforts by all of us, we will be able to bridge the gap at least to some extent and create an atmosphere wherein we are able to help at one side the government, wherein they want to bring some of their ideas and some of their efforts with the business community at large, and helping the business community on the other side to cope up with the expectations by the government. I am chairman of WIRC, and at WIRC we are doing one thing. We have formed a COVID response group with a small group of 20 people from Maharashtra, Gujarat and Goa. And what we are doing is we are trying to collate some of the suggestions of our members and we are representing at various levels so that at least we can do our bit to the betterment of the economy. Once again, sir, I welcome all of you and believe that we will be having best of the session today evening. Thank you. Back to Manoj.
Thank you.
Thank you for your opening remarks. Now, see, for the benefit of all the participants, we have already listed brief profile of all the speakers, keynote speakers on the website. So as and when they log in, they will be in a position to see that. So it will be easy and it will be not time consuming for us. But still, for the sake of formality, or it's required, I feel it is required. So I'll be giving some detail of a few achievements of all these experienced speakers. To start with, our today's keynote speaker is Mr. G.N. Bajpai, who is a distinguished leader in Indian business. He was the chairman of the SEBI. Earlier, Mr. Bajpai was chairman of LIC. Currently, Mr. Bajpai is non-executive chairman and non-executive director of several corporates in India. Mr. Bajpai is on the board of advisors of Indian Army Group Insurance Fund, and he is member of governing board of National Insurance Academy. He has been a visiting faculty at leading institutes of management and training. He has written 5 popular books. He regularly writes columns in leading Hindi and English newspapers and magazines. He has received a number of awards, notable among being the CNBC TV 18 Outstanding Contribution to the Development of Finance Award from Prime Minister of India, and W.G. Chirumale Puraskar 2014 for commendable contribution in the fields of insurance and regulation of stock market. Generally, we say that he is so-and-so is my friend, philosopher and guide. Since Mr. Bajpai is so towering a personality that I cannot say that he is my friend, but with permission of Mr. Bajpai, I may say that he is my mentor, supporter and guide, who has helped us and advised us on many matters to put before you all this webinar series as a knowledge partner. Then we have Mr. Jangu Dalal, who is going to moderate today's session. He had held the position of President India and SARC at Cisco Systems. He also served as a President India and SARC at Avaya India Private Limited. He was the Managing Director of D-Link India Limited. Mr. Jangu is passionate about corporate social responsibility and corporate governance initiatives. He is presently Managing Director of Intuit Consulting Private Limited, who is our knowledge partner for this webinar series. Thereafter, I come to the senior most Mr. Prasad Chandran, former Chairman and Managing Director of BASF India Limited. He was also Chairman of SIBA India Limited, Cyanamide India Limited, Uspa Polymers. Business Today magazine had named him among the 100 most successful CEOs in the country. In January 2016, Mr. Chandran was bestowed the Bundeswehr Din Cruz. The pronunciation is little different, but the meaning of it is the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. This is the highest civilian award in Germany for his initiatives in fostering Indo-German relations and for his social welfare activities in India in promoting ethics and better corporate governance. He is the founder chairman of SIGOS, a social enterprise for promoting ethics and fighting corruption. He is currently an independent director on the boards of Bose Limited, Coromandel International Limited, and HDFC Life, to name few. He is chairman of Ethics and Governance Committee of Bombay Chamber. Then we come to Ms. Bhavna Doshi. She is a FCA. She is founder partner of BDA LLP, an advisory firm specializing in the fields of taxation, accounting, and corporate laws. She is former senior advisor to KPMG in India and former partner of BSR and Company, heading indirect tax risk practice for the firm. She is former Central Council member of the ICAI. She served as a member of Compliance Committee of International Federation of Accounts, headquartered in New York. She is past president of IMC for the year 2011-12. She has served on the committees of CII and she is member of Managing Committee of ASSOCHAM. She serves on Advisory Council of Educational Institutes. She serves as an independent director on the boards of several listed companies. Ms. Bhavna Doshi was my chairman at the Corporate Governance Committee at IMC. Then we come to Mr. Dhanpal Jhaveri, who is a vice chairman, Everstone Group, a premier investment group focused on India and Southeast Asia. He is also the CEO for Eversource Capital, which is a joint venture between Lightsource BP and Everstone Capital to make green and sustainable investments in India. Mr. Dhanpal's previous experience include Director Corporate Strategy with Vedanta Resources PLC, Head of Investment Banking at ICICI Securities, and Partner for Corporate Finance at KPMG. Mr. Dhanpal is my chairman at the Corporate Governance Committee at IMC. Then we come to last but not the least, Ms. Amita Gupta Katragada. Amita has 15 years of experience as a lawyer in corporate M&A, disputes and governance. She is a partner at Amarchand Mangaldas, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas firm. Amita has been the lead legal counsel on several complex and path-breaking commercial transactions. Building on her law and MBA credentials, Amita has a nuanced understanding of governance issues from a business and legal perspective. She was a part of the team that drafted the Kotak Committee report on corporate governance. She was listed in the prestigious 40 Under 40 India's Hottest Business Leaders 2019 by the Economic Times. She was also recognized by Asian Legal Business in their 40 Under 40 list, which profiles 40 of the most accomplished lawyers in Asia under 40 years of age. I welcome all the speakers, the moderators and keynote speakers. Thank you very much. Over to Mr. Bajpai for his keynote speech.
Thank you, Mr. Manoj. First, well, it's I don't know whether I'm your mentor or not, but nonetheless, I would like to be mentor of anybody who is ready to take my mentorship, which may not be of great value. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And this question I have been addressing for a couple of decades now. what is the role of the board and how different it is from the role of management. When I was researching for my book, which some of you might have had an occasion to see, I was able to decipher that in most cases, this role is not clearly defined. And board seems to be replicating what management is doing. But I have philosophically been trying to build that around, and my personal feel has been that there are two roles which can be really distinctive, one for the board and another for the executive management team. The role of the executive management team is to manage the business. The role of the board is to manage the enterprise. Now, managing the business means the current health of the business as per the direction or the vision given by the board for managing the enterprise means future health of the organization. Even if we can go back to the basic law, it says that the board of directors have a fiduciary responsibility. And when I was looking at the dictionary meaning of fiduciary is to holding the enterprise in trust. Now, in case the enterprise is not sustainable, what is that the board is holding for the future? It can't be holding. So therefore, I have come to this fundamental conclusion that the role of the board is to manage the enterprise sustainability, and that is the future health. Now, let me look at quickly what is happening right now in the context of the environment that has been created by the pandemic. Now, if you see successful companies, which are mostly those companies which are supplying the essential, rest of are all in a kind of hibernation, operating from the home or doing the minimum kind of service. Most companies have changed the frames, and the frames now look like people, supply chain, demand, and cash flow. That means the significance of the stakeholders of the enterprise, which according to me are many, has shifted from primacy of the shareholders to the people in the organization first. And then the people who help the organization to be running, to be functioning like supply chain. And then of course the demand and all that. Now can we all travel back in time? And I'm deliberately trying to go back into history to be able to help the current set of managers to decide what the kind of methodology or the approach they should be adopting in the current scenario. Now, according to me, invention of joint stock companies sometime in the middle of 17th century was the greatest invention. It brought into focus three distinctive features of an institution: perpetual succession, common seal, and separation of ownership from the management. And this perpetual succession means sustainability. If the organization, because there will be current stakeholders of the enterprise, there will be future stakeholders, and therefore there is a perpetual succession. And in case the board is not able to manage the sustainability of the organization, how it is going to have the benefit of perpetual succession to the next generation of the stakeholders. The second point, which is what the father of economics, Adam Smith, pointed out, was the agency problem, the separation of management from the from the ownership and control. And therefore, what happened was that a set of people started managing the interest of all other, which is called not the dominant, silent dominant majority. Now, can we fast forward into time? In the modern times, what happened was sometime in 1929, when the great market crash and the recession started in the United States, the first foremost dignified legislation was passed, what is called Securities Act of 1933, and also
Sorry, Bajpai ji.
securities. Yeah.
May I just disturb you for a minute? Can you switch on your camera? You're not visible.
Oh, my camera, Bonavan, because it is saying that, okay. Can you get it?
Now you are there. Perfect. Now we can see
all
you.
right. Okay,
Thank
okay.
you.
All right.
Thank
Now, in this particular legislation, the philosophy that was that it must govern the corporate behavior and protect the interest of stakeholders. Now, based on that, if you look at the management literature that developed thereafter, and the father of management science, Peter Drucker, wrote two seminal works. One was the concept of the corporation in 1946. The another one was the practice of management, which articulated timeless principles. It was in 1954, and both these seminal works articulated how to balance the interests of various stakeholders. But suddenly, somewhere in 1970, the then supposed to be the god of economics, Milton Friedman, in a very influential article, he wrote into New York Times, and he propounded what is called a shareholder theory or a Friedman doctrine. And he stated in that theory a very interesting, I have a small slip out to read for your benefit, if those of you have not read. In a free enterprise, private property driven system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owner of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That is the responsibility to conduct the business in accordance with their desires. And owners, he is going to say, are the shareholders. The key point is that in his capacity as a corporate executive, the manager is an agent of the individuals who own the corporation, and his primary responsibility is to them. And he propounded that, well, the firm exists for the benefit of the shareholders. And thereafter, of course, as it happens, the business professors, including Harvard professor, they propounded what is called a maximizing shareholder returns. And then all that happened, that the whole focus of the managing the enterprise on the board shifted to managing or maximizing the profitability or for the wealth for the stakeholder. In the meantime, lots of development took place. First was a series of scandals that came out. Enron, Grover Crossing, Tyco, WorldCom, any number you can think of. And also the inequality grew very, very substantially. And the ecology, the environment itself became a serious challenge for the planet as a whole. Under this process, number of voices started saying that this prominence of the shareholder theory is not desirable. It has not done well. And in fact, in a very, very influential article, written by a very important person, he said why maximizing shareholder theory is finally dying. And he said in an article which is very interesting to quote here, which he blew up the theory, what is called maximizing shareholder value. For almost 2 decades following the doctrine, the corporation justified bamboozling customers, squeezing workers and suppliers, and avoiding taxes and lavishing stock options on the executives. Now, this was described as the dumbest of the ideas, which was promoted by Milton Friedman. And that article, and also, as I said earlier, the inequality which has been rising, which has been focused by many economists, starting from Thomas Piketty to his own guru, Atkinson, that finally in August 2019, the US Business Roundtable signed, all the CEOs, 181 present, signed a statement, and they committed to lead the companies for the benefit of all stakeholders, and which includes employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. Now, the community is very important from the angle of environment. And based on that, the new philosophical angle of ESG, environment, sustainability, and the governance has started. In fact, in a very interesting article, Mr. Cyril Brossi has proposed the new concept. And that the new concept that he proposes is that the frame of the management of the enterprise by the board should be mission rather than strategy, stakeholders rather than the shareholders, outcomes rather than the milestones, financial and non-financials rather than the only view on financials, and end-to-end cycle rather than overlapping for a short while. Now, based on this, now if we can look at what is the influential voices across the world are talking about. Larry Fink, for example, the one who heads BlackRock, $7 trillion, he said he is not going to invest into companies which do not work for environment, sustainability, and governance, which do not take care of the all stakeholders. And likewise, there are many, many voices happening. Now, with the result, now, if you look at the people also, and the people are also talking about joining those companies which have a purpose, which have a mission-driven organization. Based on these thought processes, there are certain new philosophical angles which are emerging. But before I go to that, what kind of thoughts are emerging? Now let us look at what is happening to the corporations in the new pandemic environment. Now corporation is asking, we are in problem. We are facing an economic death. Please help us. And they want that please share the cruelty of the pandemic which is now going to. Now look at all these guys in the past which I was trying to trace the history were not bothered about what is happening to the environment or what is happening to the society. Now today suddenly they are talking about that please help us. They are asking the people whom they did not as much care that do whatever it is, please keep the business running to the extent possible. Because in the process what has happened, there are millions who have been tormented. There are billions who have been locked out, and there are trillions of wealth which is being destroyed right now. In this environment, the new agenda for the board has therefore necessarily to be not only looking at the shareholders alone, but they have got to drive the organization. What is the mission of this organization, or what is the purpose this organization exists? Why this organization should be running the business, and if it has to run the business, how can it sustain the business? So first and foremost is, in fact, Isabella, one of the greatest political scientists right now, she has proposed what is called a political theory of the firm. And the political theory of the firm means that egalitarian approach. That means everybody, every stakeholder in a society has to be treated equally. And if that is going to be the philosophy which is going to work, and in fact, as I said, the influential voice is already pronouncing that, hey guys, in case you are not going to balance the interest of various stakeholders in the society who are helping the organization to come into existence, who are helping the organization to sustain its existence, then I'm not going to be the one who is going to support you with our financial capital that I have the charge to manage. Now, it is in this environment, today's board must sit down, revisit the philosophy of the management of the enterprise, switch the tone of the boardroom practices to be looking at the interest of all stakeholders. And as I said, in the current environment, in the face, particularly the pandemic, people who work for the organization, who support the organization, become the very, very fundamental pillar of the strength of the organization. And the journey has to start from there. We have got to care those people who supply goods, services, the financial capital or otherwise. Then we have to look at who are my customers and how do I take care of those customers with the help of my human resources. In fact, what Isabella has propounded is a very interesting. She talks about what is called the economic theory of the firm and the political theory. The economic theory of the firm is to serve the economic purpose of the individuals who participate. And therein she talks about what is called, very interestingly, she talks about what is called expressive rationality and what is called instrumental rationality. And since there is a lawyer connecting here, I might like to explain what I'm talking about. The instrumental rationality of joining a firm is that I have a capital, I want to maximize the capital, I have the return, and therefore, or similarly, I have a labor, I want to offer my labor for a return, or that I have goods I want to supply. This is called what is called instrumental rationality. But the expressive rationality, which in particular the society and the individuals are talking about, is that I associate with this firm deliberately. And also I put my life and resources into it. And in case if I'm going to do that, I must be eligible to, I must ask for, and I must get the required amount of resources. Now, let me conclude by saying that whether the pandemic, hopefully, God willing, with the efforts of the scientists as also the healthcare professionals who are today kind of God's agent, if not the godlike actions they are doing, we will survive. But in the new survived environment, if the firms have to survive, they have got to adopt a new methodology, and that methodology has to be of taking care of all the stakeholders and looking at the future of the enterprise, not only from today's angle, from tomorrow's angle. And for looking at from tomorrow's angle, it will be very important and necessary that they look at the sustainability, how each stakeholder is going to be satisfied. Now, with these few words, I will offer it back to moderator to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bajpai. May I request Mr. Jangu Dalal to take over, please?
Good evening, friends, fellow panelists, and everybody who's taken the time out this evening to join our webinar. First and foremost, on behalf of all the panelists as well as the invitees, our great gratitude to Mr. Bajpai for his always as inspiring keynote as always. I think in terms of capturing the essence of today's title of the seminar, which is a purpose-driven multi-stakeholder view, I don't think we could have had a better 15-minute summation of the topic. I think his passionate keynote will inspire this panel to share their views over the next 1 hour or so. The way we're going to run this panel discussion is I'm going to run a few questions by our panelists. At the same time, people who are invitees, participants can also key in on the chat box, and as and when we get an opportunity, we will start moving with these. I think we need to get Prasad's video unmuted. Prasad, can you join us? Okay, so whilst we wait for Prasad, let's get going with our discussion this evening. Let me start with Dhanpal. Dhanpal, as the vice chairman of Everstone and one of the largest investors, private equity investor, venture capitalist in the country representing that firm. For you, the board of any investing company, and you have quite a few investments over the years, is a key representative of your interests in the organization. They're almost like a proxy for you within the firm that you've invested in, the investee firm. Now, in these turbulent times, are your expectations of the directors of your investee firms getting higher? What do you think are some of the challenges they face? And what is it that, as a key investor, you would expect directors to do differently or more of in terms of focus?
So, Jangu, thanks a lot. First of all, Bajpai, as usual, you always impress us, and today there's no difference. I think some of the points I was actually taking down notes furiously. I would love you to share if you have a written kind of a text of what you have talked about. Clearly, lots of very interesting points, especially given, I think what we've been largely seeing, right, is the very rapid corruption of the governance systems within corporate India, and even what we are seeing in many other parts of the world. And I think the role of the board, which is fundamentally to set strategy and direction and to basically manage risk, is kind of being challenged in many ways, because the definition of a stakeholder is getting a lot more wider and more encompassing than what we have been basically narrowly focused on in our kind of view in the recent past. And as a private equity investor, I think if you look at what is our purpose and why we kind of exist, right? I think the first and fundamental purpose for us is to basically be I would say catalyst for capital moving to corporations, which can use that to create gainful employment and growth, and then finally through that generate returns for our investors. It's a fairly simplistic kind of a view, but I think in that simplistic view, I think what gets embedded is the fact that we are, one, long-term seekers of return. Therefore, we tend to invest for a longer period of time. Two is we see growth in our businesses, which means that we are actually generating more jobs and more output, which is what kind of is the, I would say, bedrock of any economy. And three, is essentially we create institutions which are independently sustainable. So even though we as a capital provider are there or maybe move on because at some point in time we need to exit and get out, the institution that has been essentially backed, supported, and hopefully growth which has been created, that is sustainable going forward. And I think if you look at the subject of this seminar, which is all about corporate sustainability, especially in this time of COVID, I think India over the last 18 months has already in some ways been dealing with a very challenged external environment. The various reform programs of the government, the huge stress that we've seen in the banking and in the credit system as a whole, and the fact that we've actually seen demand destruction due to many reasons, and therefore slow growth of the economy is already kind of challenged many corporate boards to kind of figure out what's the right way to basically protect and then basically grow. So in some ways, unlike I would say the global financial crisis, we have been already as I would say board members and owners of businesses been kind of preparing ourselves for some sort of I would say a winter which had been kind of set in. I think to a certain extent we are starting to see spring because the last 2 quarters were seeing some growth. We were seeing those offshoots of growth, but unfortunately COVID has completely put, I would say that on a hold, and it's in fact, if anything, we are likely in danger of actually receding quite badly. And I think a biggest fear I have as an Indian and as a kind of I would say someone who is first focused on the country is really that we are in serious danger of potentially at least maybe moving back 10 or 20 years in what we've been doing as a country to move people out of poverty to possibly resetting that clock or rewinding that clock, right? And I think that's going to be all our kind of joint and collective responsibility to see how we try and mitigate that. It starts with the corporation itself, right? What are we doing with our own employees? And therefore, in many ways, we've pivoted the role of the, I think Mr. Bajpai touched upon it, right? The primary role or the primacy of stakeholder relationship of the board is really as a custodian for the shareholder. And then obviously customers and employees and all of those were kind of talked about in the broader sense. I think that primacy of role has actually shifted to that being of the employees, and employees not just directly employed by the corporation, but also employees or people who are dependent on the corporation's survival and existence for their own survival and existence. And I think that today, especially in a crisis like this, is where I think the board has to first focus on. That what are we doing? There's a medical crisis which becomes a humanitarian crisis, and what is the immediate action the board is taking first to protect the well-being of their employees and people who are dependent on the corporation. So if you ask me what was the first action plan we took was really that, right? And in that, one of the most important things is because in the best of times, it's very difficult to project even 1 year forward, right? We all make financial plans, and all of you have been party to all of these processes of building AOPs, annual business plans, and 3-year plans and all of that. In the best of times, we know that these plans are never either overachieved or underachieved, right? You rarely get your plans corrected. In a time like this, where the entire volatility has reached a level where it's absolutely impossible even to predict what's going to happen in the next month, plans are completely out of the window, and therefore only what you can look at is for signals. And therefore, when there is such uncertainty, you have to first ensure that the corporation can survive. So the second step was really for us to basically see that do we have enough cash to last this winter, and which is likely to be anywhere, in my view today, at least 12 months before you really start seeing any sort of normalization start creeping in. And that I'm linking it more to the commercialization of a vaccine at an affordable price where the world can then feel safe to basically stop social distancing, right? And I believe that's going to be your key barometer as to when you can start actually engaging as a social economy. And that's when really the economy will come back to what I believe is the new normal there. And the third, clearly, I think, is really planning and preparing. Because what you do have today is most companies have seen revenues reduced by anywhere between 15 to maybe even 100%. Many sectors, I think, are finished. Many players within those sectors will never be able to come back. And therefore, how do you plan and prepare yourself? And that's where the board's role becomes extremely important. Whether it be, thinking through the existing business model, whether it's relevant or not in this new environment, thinking through the management team, is the leadership and the succession plan something that is thought through well? And then finally, obviously, preparing for that point in time when hopefully we can all go back to work and really start rebuilding our economy and our businesses. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Dhanpal. I think the one key message I picked up from your opening remarks was about picking up signals within the organization is becoming increasingly important in a time where plans are going out of the window. And I think one of the key signals which all of us as captains of industry or investors, stakeholders look forward to are the financial statements which companies bring out. So let's move to Bhavna ji. Bhavna, you've been kind of a leading statutory authority, a tax friend, an auditor friend, a mentor to lots of companies that you serve, financial, statutorily, as well as chambers. In this kind of an environment, what do you think are the impacts, lighthouses, signals which people should look out in terms of framing and getting their financial statements together?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the last sentence, but I understand it is that what should the companies be doing? I mean, what should the boards be looking at when the financial statements are presented?
Jangu, can you respond to her? Your
Yeah,
voice is not
now
being
I
heard.
can hear you.
Okay, okay.
So you are
Okay, I
muted
think I'm having
using
a bit of a network glitch.
it's fine. Yeah, so it doesn't matter. I'll just respond. So picking up the thread from what where Dhanpal left, that essentially it's very tough time, challenging time, and therefore everyone is really looking at survival for self, and then the survival of the entire surrounding. So given this scenario, when we look at the financial statements and when they are presented to the board, what are the assumptions that the management has made is going to be very critical. Going concern is going to be a biggest challenge. And as we've been hearing people telling us that some of the businesses may not survive at all. Is that one of the consequences for the company on the board of which you are serving? Will that company have challenge of survival itself? And what are the assumptions that are being made by the management to come to the conclusion that yes, they will survive, they will be able to face this pandemic successfully? And that's where they may have changed some business plans, they may have looked at. So again, here we'll have to distinguish between very large and medium and other organizations. So if you have somebody like a technology company, say Infosys, Wipro, TCS, these are giants. For them also there will be uncertainties, but survival will never be a challenge, at least in the foreseeable future. Whereas if there is a medium-sized company, maybe they would have. So we'll have to look at several aspects. Some will be, of course, qualitative, but the additional expenses that the businesses will have to incur, and there are so many aspects which would be presented to the board, where board will have to take a view as to whether in the foreseeable future, what are the challenges that we are seeing. What is the foreseeable future itself is becoming a question mark. Should it be just the 12 months period which we generally look at, or should it be maybe 2 years or 3 years, a little longer period of time? Maybe we all will understand that next 12 months will be a challenge. And as even Dhanpal was saying, that till such time as we have to stop social distancing, there will be challenges. And the moment we are able to stop that, then only we'll be able to really get out of this issue. And then we'll also have to, of course, as board, we will have the auditors coming and telling us what do they think, what are the assumptions they've made, which are the key audit matters, what are the procedures that they have followed. Because ultimately, when we talk of sustainability, people depend on the decision of the management. And how do we communicate that? How do we communicate the board's perspective to the stakeholders is through our financial statements, which is our really the communication, key communication model. So there are several aspects which we'll have to be aware of, whether it is revenue recognition, whether it is impairment. These are the key aspects. And some of the financial statements which have been released, what we see is that they have clearly stated that there are uncertainties. It's very difficult to estimate what these uncertainties will be or quantify them, and we'll have to take a quarter-on-quarter view. So what we will now find for next at least 3 quarters for sure, is quarter-on-quarter view as to what are we doing to ensure that we remain sustainable. Same way internal auditors, because they are also finding it very, very challenging to really look at the systems processes. And my key focus has been wherever the internal auditors make any presentation or management makes any presentation, that employees are today working from home. Your data is accessed from several places, locations. So what are the measures that you've taken in terms of cybersecurity, your data security? So that has been a key focus from my perspective whenever I discuss with the internal auditors. Thank you. Your mic, Jimbo, your mic seems to be
Mike,
Even mute, I suppose. No?
Django, your mic.
I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Do something. Huh?
Yeah, so maybe
Yeah.
organizers
Am I back?
sometimes mute. Maybe sometimes
Yes. Can you hear me
organizers
now?
mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. My apologies to everyone. I was in between toggling between unmuting myself and the organizer trying to do something. So, Bhavna, thanks for your perspective. You're going from signals to looking at quarters very, very closely. Let's move to Prasad. Prasad, you've had the unique experience of driving some of the largest, most diversified manufacturing organizations in India. You continue to be associated with them. These are multi-locational organizations. In a sense, they are kind of the growth locomotives of our economic engine. But at the same time, I think they might be facing the maximum number of pressures, factory shutdown, employees having collateral damage somewhere, vendor suppliers all in a limbo. So what is your perspective as and when we get past this COVID phase? What is the role these large manufacturing multi-locational organizations can play to break the Indian economy, restart it, bring it back on its roads? And to that extent, what will be the role of the board itself to guide the organization to kind of restart, rejig our economy as and when we slowly get out of this tough phase?
Thank you, Django. And in the background that has been created both with Mr. Bajpayi's talk and Bhavnaben's outline, I would like to share in the beginning that we are in the midst of a major pandemic in the country. However, the one big silver lining is the agriculture sector. Just for all of you that as of yesterday, I was reviewing the All India agricultural situation, and in most states, between 70 to 100% of the Rabi crop has been harvested. And by and large, the agriculture sector is, and which, as you know, while it contributes only 15% of the GDP, more than 55% of our population is dependent and on livelihood on agriculture. So I just want to leave this background in terms of the current situation on the pandemic. So the lens in the urban cities are very different from rural India at this point of time. Now, coming to multinationals, I would like to, at this point of time, in the midst of this pandemic, for these large multinationals, the role of the board would be to find this equitable balance of sustainability, which means between the economics, the business environment, and the stakeholders. Right now, when you talk about the economics, I would talk about protection, erosion of the to prevent any erosion of the capital. Most important, the working capital, to make sure that the large companies, whichever way the RBI has opened up a lot of windows, whether it is a corporate bond, whether it is need to go for debt, because some of the large companies have never taken debts, but maybe you want to relook at it because you want to make sure that for the next 2 quarters, your working capital is very well taken care of. And financials, you got to look from a quarter to quarter. Because because most of the board meeting just got over, the last financial year was pretty good because till about the 15th of March, and suddenly from the last 15 days is when the balance sheets have been affected. But the first quarter, and April has been a washout, and the first quarter is going to be pretty bad, and there onwards the visibility is for the second and the third quarter. So from a financial point of view, while you have the long-term strategy very much in the background and the annual budgets there, we got to look at from a quarter to quarter and make sure for the next 2 quarters the financials are ready. So of the immediate thing of the financials, then you look at the business environment. When I look at the business environment, very important for large manufacturing companies is to look at how do we restart our plants, which all states do you want, which state is your plant in the red zone or the people in the red zone, and immediately you got to help the board come to a decision of whether you want to start all plants in all the states now, taking a positive view, saying that in the next 6 months, we are going to see a ramp up of the economy, and there will be need for all the manufactured products to come on stream. Now, that's a view that you got to take in terms of extreme difficulties, because the large companies could have tremendous amount of unseen difficulties in terms of the changing rules and regulations. Every day there is a new circular, there is a new set of rules, not only from the central government and the federal government, the states and the panchayats. If somewhere you are located, where your factory is located, you have the panchayat president giving you some kind of a thing, and you got to make sure that the board and the management is aware of it, and you are able to both respond to it and not react to these emergencies. Now, I'm very carefully using the word because that's where the board comes in terms of helping the managements to respond to these situations. So that's the financials, that's the business environment. Now come to the stakeholders. Undoubtedly, the stakeholders are my employees. You know, that's where you have the major challenge in terms of the employees and what you want to do with the employees and make sure they get the right signals. Across the country, the multifarious divisions that many companies operate with, people have their own anxieties. So your employees have to be given the stability, the security that they need, and open, transparent communication. In the sense that there will be some cuts that might take place. There will be some divisions which might be, or some businesses which are going to be impacted. Boards must be very clear, honest, and transparent in their communications to their employees, so that every single employee up to the last knows where his or her position is based. So to the stakeholders for large companies, particularly manufacturing companies, after the employers are our suppliers and customers. Particularly customers, suppliers from the MSME. I would like to make sure that the MSME suppliers are protected, particularly those which supply more than 60 to 70% of their products to the large companies. Every board must make sure they have the list of such suppliers and we got to make sure that we stand by them, support them financially, support them technically, and whichever whichever basis they need, so that these MSMEs can support. And then, of course, the customers. So from an equitable point of view, my view of sustainability is for boards to make sure that the managements have this balance between the economics, the environment, and their stakeholders. That's from me.
Thanks, Prasad. Well articulated on the balance between environment and the stakeholders, employees, and obviously the financials. Let's move to Amrita. You know, Amrita, among all the chaos which is going on and the pressures which corporates are facing, there is this inevitable wealth erosion which is happening all around. There are pressures on management to look after employees, stakeholders, all kinds of issues. If I was an executive manager or a board member, one of the other things which would probably keep me awake are, is there some round the corner legal issues, legal challenges which boards and companies would face in this daunting kind of environment? What's your perspective? Are there certain major legal things which the board as the custodians need to watch out for? And as a corollary to that, besides watching out, looking out, are there some things, processes wise, etc., which we can do proactively to protect ourselves? Amrita.
Yeah. Thank you, Jangu, and thanks to all for all the very useful inputs that even I have had a chance to take down. I think the big aspect is that we're actually facing a health crisis, and this health crisis is actually driven what I would call a sudden death situation. So it's not something that you could have anticipated for so long, that you should have had a risk plan in place, that you should have stress tested in advance and then put it into place when this actually hits. I think the one level that directors are protected from is that it is not an expected reference, that this is something that should have been planned for, and therefore the crisis management should not be in line with something that was already contemplated. So having said that, there is still a big role for the board to play, and that they will get checked upon from a liability standpoint, and that is how do they manage the crisis going forward. Mr. Bajpai gave a very, very interesting oversight of how the role of the board has evolved over the years, from shareholder primacy to where it is today on stakeholder governance. And while the rest of the world is still coming into the stakeholder governance model through voluntary adoptions by the CEOs of various companies, India has actually moved this into a statutory space. Section 166 of the Companies Act 2013, way back in 2013, brought in place stakeholder governance as being the model that has been adopted in India for what is going to be the fiduciary responsibility for the board. What are the stakeholders that we are talking about? There are 5 sets of stakeholders that are specifically identified under law. These are the company, the shareholders, employees, the community, and the protection of the environment. All these 5 stakeholders have been put on par on top of that. So, all the historical case law and the theories that have existed about how the board owes a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders has actually moved into a completely different space, because now the fiduciary responsibility of the board is actually to manage all these 5 sets of stakeholders. These stakeholders have been put on par, so there is no specific hierarchy that would apply, which is why the biggest dilemma that we are helping boards run through today is A, identifying what trade-offs they are making when they are making a decision at the board during the time of the crisis. B, how are they weighing the interests of the different stakeholders? And C, when they are making a decision, how is it adequately covering them from a legal liability standpoint? And I'll give you an example. Business continuity is obviously a big aspect, and lots of companies are reviewing the fact that their costs are far outpacing the cash on the books. So, they have very difficult choices to make. Should I pay all my employees and, run out of money by October? Should I, furlough some employees and allow the company to continue till March? There are all these really hard questions that companies are having to ask, and boards have to make those decisions. And it's not a light decision that can be taken, because at the end of the day, and this is what we are advising companies, is that, at the end of this crisis, different stakeholders are going to be at different states of desperation. So we think that there is just one judicial innovation away for a class action by employees or by the community to be something that is actually valid and viable under the Indian law. So in June last year, Section 245 of the Companies Act has been notified by the government. This essentially allows for a class action by shareholders against the board for a breach of what they see as their fiduciary responsibilities. Given that fiduciary responsibilities are owed to these groups of stakeholders, it is just as likely that some court will now hold, and there is the shifting empathy of the courts in favor of employees, migrant labor. We're seeing that every day. That it's very likely that the courts will push through a judicial innovation to say that even employees or members of the community may actually bring a class action against the board, at which point it is up to the board to be able to defend itself and say that when it made its decision, it adequately weighed the trade-offs between the different stakeholders and made the right decision. And this is actually protected under what we call the business judgment rule. It is something that will be available to directors. But what happens when we actually building the defense on a retrospective basis is that very often on a retrospective basis, it looks like, well, how the hell did you take that decision? When you're making the decision, it feels like the right thing because you're in the middle of all the data and the human elements involved in that decision. But in retrospect, and all these cases will come up 2-3 years from now, in retrospect, it doesn't look that obvious, which is actually my second point to the group, is that it is really, really important to be able to capture rightly what was the data and the human elements involved, documented very, very clearly as to how the decision-making process was followed, not only in compliance with law, but in a very purposive manner, so that we can demonstrate, if ever in the future, and the future is quite unknown at this point, that the boards have in fact managed their responsibility and have acted in the best interests of the stakeholders given the circumstances.
Thanks, Amrita. With all the pressures of the environment and stakeholders and financial results, board of directors now also have to worry about class action. I think the only way out of it is following your dharma as a board director and doing the right and honest thing at all times. Now, moving back to Bhavnaji, as an investor in shares or different companies, I am currently, like many other people, very curious as to what is going on in the companies that I've invested in. What are they thinking about? What are their future plans, etc. And one of the vehicles for me to know more about this is the MDA, the Management Discussion and Analysis report. What do you think would be the evolving role of the MDA? Should there be even more focus on it by the board and the executive management in terms of being transparent and fulfilling the genuine interests and curiosity of investors like myself?
We can't hear you, Bhanwan.
Bhavna, I think you'll have to unmute.
Yeah. So.
Okay, we can hear you.
Yeah. So as you said, the MDA is going to be extremely, extremely challenging for all the businesses to prepare, particularly for the year ending March 2020 now, and then of course later, how you communicate. Now, as we heard, there are several aspects which will have to be borne in mind, and you have this whole ESG concept. And when you normally see the board report, you talk about everyone's interest. So you talk about the performance of the company, what affected the performance of the company, and what do you see going forward. Now, going forward is such uncertain future today that it's extremely difficult for anyone to really give a very clear picture. But at the same time, the board will have to ensure that whatever is given there, whatever management is given and whatever board reviews, is a clearly drawn or thought through process where you have done what I say is COVID stress test. apply the stress test and see what is likely to happen in your case. Now you will have several situations which you will have to look into. And take a simple example that you had originally planned. Say you are a glass manufacturer and you had planned that you will set up a captive power plant, which would have reduced your cost and would have given better returns to the investors. Suddenly now you find that there is not adequate cash available, you are conserving resources, and therefore you will now not set up that plant. Suddenly shareholders find that to that extent now the investors find that their money is going, their returns are going to be reduced. Cash flow is not available, dividends may not be distributed. So to that extent, some of the investors who are dependent on the dividends will not find it. I mean, there are several areas which one can keep on thinking about, but it would depend on sector to sector, company to company. What applies to a bank and what applies to an NBFC is going to be very different from what applies to a manufacturing company or to a service provider. And everyone has those peculiar nuances which will have to be factored in. But to my mind, one of the key message which I see most of the companies communicating through MDA is the fact that there are uncertainties. We are really not able to tell you what's it likely to be. These are the factors which will play a role. We have taken this measures, but uncertainty is there.
Thanks, Bhavna. I feel drafting MDAs is going to be a real onerous task if the executive management and boards really take that seriously. Friends who are listening into the webinar, on your control panel of GoToWebinar, there is this little chat box where you can put in any questions if you would like to ask this August panel. So keep punching them in. I'll read them up and push them out to the right panelist as you would desire. One of the benefits of the panel that we have today is the absolute hands-on experience that all of the panelists bring onto the table. Prasad, you've served boards and you continue to serve boards as we speak in this crisis-driven world. I think people who are attending this session would be most keen to know, as it were, firsthand, from the horse's mouth, as it were, what are the kind of discussions which are going on in these hollowed virtual platforms, boardrooms that we have today? What are the stresses, tensions, growth factors that you are talking about? Is the board becoming very anxiety driven, or is it becoming more supportive of management? What's going on in these virtual hollowed boardrooms? Share some stories with us without naming the company.
Thank you, Jagu, and with so many stakeholders around and so many legal people around, I hope I'm not going to be charged with something else on insider information. But but let me, on a very broad sense, give you a sense of what is happening. That the first board meeting immediately as you know, that April, May is when we have the first board meetings to the quarter for the last year's results. And invariably, the board's biggest concern is in terms of the employees and the kind of fear that people would have. So we started off with every board. I'm very happy that the board has come on their own to say that the top post management, the KMPs, the key managerial personnel, they have volunteered to take 25% cut on their salaries, and onto the senior management, say a 15 to 10% cut, and of course protecting the people and the frontline people to give them a clear assurance that there will be no deduction in salaries, so that there will be no and those of the people who are seriously impacted by way of their areas, or in terms of illnesses, or if somebody in the family has been impacted, there is a whole lot of HR processes that have been worked. And in every company, I was very happy that the board was presented by the HR of the contingencies that they are coming on from a people point of view. So I think that has been a very high, serious top line in terms of the companies presenting their concerns, and also what measures they are taking to mitigate. As you know, the problem with this pandemic is that you might have entire departments going off in terms of not doing social distances. For example, in a manufacturing company, you have the safety head and his number 2 and number 3 and number 4. If they've had a meeting together and if they had met physically at any point of time, now, of course, the last 15, 20 days, everybody is very, very keen. But if at any point of time they had met, you might have the entire department go away. And that's where you need to make sure that you have contingency plans where some very critical departments, number 1, number 2, and number 3, might get infected and be out of action. So that's the emergency plans, and therefore the second and third lines of defense are done up by the company. Another point I want to make from a manufacturing standpoint was the major crisis that had come up in terms of logistics. It was because of the sudden close down on the 24th of end of March. The difference between essential commodities and non-essential commodities made it very difficult, because the entire highway of goods and services coming into the plants or going out were all blocked. And a number of the drivers and they just deserted and went away. That's taken a huge challenge on logistics, onto the highways and in the ports. Some critical raw materials are stuck up, or you might have the components not into the plant. So that's another major area that manufacturing plants are, where the boards and they have been brought to the notice, to which emergency needs are taken. I must tell you that the last 1 week has seen a tremendous amount of calming down. The last 1 week, the ports are getting, quite a number of the ports, not across, but most of the ports, there is a movement. And the airports, of course, are all working now. I mean, I'm working in the sense of goods to go. And from China, from Germany, there are instances, of course, right now it's the medical equipment, but even critical raw materials will be, one can get in. So situation is improving over the last 4 or 5 days. So if you ask me what's been on the board, people and how to start the plants. These are the two major issues that are being consuming the boards.
I think this is very heartening input, Prasad. All of us would be really keen to know that, and glad to know that things are beginning to inch forward, and you have a first-hand view of saying that over the last 4 or 5 days, 1 week, things are gradually coming back to normal. Continuing in this vein, Dhanpal, with the amount of investee companies you have across industries, these companies, their boards would have also had some very interesting conversations for the last few weeks. Is there any particular example, instance you can share of some investee company of yours which has done something very innovative, stellar, out of the box, which is really shown out?
Yeah, you're right. I think we do have a fairly diverse, because we've got hospital companies, we've got medical device businesses, we've got pharmaceutical companies, we've got, tech companies, we've got financial services businesses. So it's a I would say, restaurants. So we've had the worst and possibly not the worst also types of experiences. I think besides all that everyone's talked about on the employee front, I think one of the first things that we wanted to also do is that how do we go and do an outreach program with the communities, because a lot of our stakeholders, whether it be people in the distribution chain or people in the supply chain or customers, particularly a lot of our customers tend to be consumers, etc. So there's been a huge amount of, I would say, innovation around how do you basically, because the lockdown pretty much froze everything possible, right? So we have a consumer brands business called Modern Breads, which is a very mature category. If you think of breads as a category, it's a fairly mature category, right? It generally, as an industry, grows 8 to 10%. And we saw a sudden spike because everyone was basically at home eating sandwiches, right? So we saw suddenly, production grow at 30% per annum. And our challenge became that how do we actually get our factories producing at 110% of capacity? And where supply chain, like Mr. Prasad said, completely broken down, right? At the same time, we had in our restaurant business, we owned the Burger King brand in India, and we were forced to shut down all the restaurants. But we realized that there is a massive challenge of getting food to the frontline workers. So 60 of our restaurants actually overnight, we were able to basically just open them up to basically just becoming delivery, food production and delivery outlets to basically reach out to the frontliners, the healthcare workers, the the people, the policemen, etc., just to basically make sure that we can get some sort of a support going out to them. So yes, I mean, I would say Burger King would be possibly, our restaurant business would be one of the most affected. As you know, everything's under lockdown, right? But we felt that this is the time that you have to really think beyond just yourself and really be there out there for even people within your community. So if you think about innovation, I think our hospitals business, right? One of the big challenges with hospitals is that how do you segregate a COVID versus a non-COVID patient, right? Because the chance of first affecting your frontline workers, your doctors, and they're ultimately human beings there. How do you give them comfort that, look, we're going to take care of you, provide you with the PPE, etc., whatever is required to make sure. And at the same time, cooperating with the government to make sure that we do and we can actually support, not just, because a lot of the COVID positive patients are asymptomatic. So it's very difficult, right, when a person is walking into the hospital to figure out whether a person has or does not have COVID. So I think the innovation has been all about that. Really getting to the front line and making sure that people are safe, making sure that we can do something for the community in such a tough environment. And obviously there is, I think at the end of the day, I have seen a just unbelievable level of response. And I actually see the positive response really not from the senior folks, but a lot of the the field officers, they are the ones who are first out there saying, look, we need to do this. And innovation actually has been absolutely at the grassroots rather than in the boardroom. And we actually went out and asked people, right, what should we do? And hundreds of suggestions came in, and then the teams basically decided to act upon it on that basis.
Yeah, I think I would also like to supplement that whenever, I mean, of course, every board meeting, the first issue that is discussed is about the employees, and we are given update as to what we are doing for employees, employee engagement. But as Dhanpal is saying, it's at the ground level people, at people who are out there, who are near factories, near plants, who want to really get engaged. They want to do something different. They want to reach out the local communities, also want to reach out to other employees and ensure that if somebody is not feeling too good, they want to reach out to that person and say, oh, don't feel so bad about it, things are good, and so on and so forth. So it's been working really wonderfully, how people are all engaging and getting involved.
Thanks, Dhanpal, and thanks, Bhavna. Just quickly move to Amita one more time. Amita, I'm sure we'll come out of this sooner or later, and people will start reinvesting in capital and all kinds of other resources going forward into corporations. But do you think that the world that we will see in the post-COVID environment, especially due to the fact that as a human race during this COVID period, we've kind of given the environment a break, as it were. Once life starts again, do you, having interacted with so many companies, think that ESG is going to get more centrality? Imperatives around ESG are going to become even more important as we go forward?
Yeah, Jangu. I think, very often you'll hear investors and companies say the one thing they have realized is that cash is king. And if there's anything that's going to make sure that there will be some sort of business continuity or perpetual succession that Mr. Vajpayee talked about, it is have you managed to balance your cash on books? So we do expect that there will be a lot of capital raising that will happen in the next year. Valuations will be low, but it will still be the right call for businesses to raise capital. And obviously then the question will be what kind of capital will be raised, and that will go back to what is the available capital both in India as well as the world over. And this brings me to what Mr. Bajpayee put through in his opening remarks, where he said the big capital is actually come with asset managers like BlackRock, who have very clearly put it out expressly that ESG is a primary focus for them. So they will be either that you already have them as an investor in your company, in which case they are going to force you to consider ESG, or if you are able to demonstrate that you are ESG compliant, you will be able to attract very good long-term capital. So either ways, ESG is going to be much more central. It's been talked about for the last 3 years quite strongly. Somewhere in the middle of last year, it was hijacked by the whole environmentalist model, but we do see that in post-COVID situation, given especially the climate impact that COVID has seen, including better weather and better climate outcomes, the S and the G are going to take on a much stronger role. The fact that businesses may want to rush back into full-fledged occupation, but their S in the ESG will also make them think through whether in the norms of social distancing that will have to continue over the next 12 to 18 months, is it the right thing to ramp up both production or access or whatever is the business that they're running? There are very fundamental questions being asked in things like the shared economy, which have become the main focus of a number of startups. And it does look like the shared economy related business plans are all up with a big question, and all of them will need to then demonstrate the ESG requirements and how that will actually drive it.
Thanks, Amita. Panelists, we have a very lively audience. I've got a whole bunch of questions here, and they have been kind enough to mark the person whom they want to address their question. So the first question is addressed to Prasad Chandran, and this is from Mr. Rajiv Chobe. And I'll just read out the question for you, Prasad. Here it goes. Do you feel companies should recall any announced CapEx projects, as the current theme is to conserve cash? Do you feel that the cash so conserved can then be used to buying out any stressed assets at the right time? This would particularly be true for sectors where demand has been little lagging behind additional capacities. So what is your view? Conserving cash, using it for stressed assets, demand challenged sectors, etc.
There are two ways. One is that most of the capex plans that you had would have been in the context of the long-term strategies within which your annual strategy was taken on. Manufacturing plants do not look at capex in terms of an immediacy of it. It is as part of the long-term and the annual plans. But in the COVID pandemic, what has happened is that the ultimate consuming industries have had a major shift. For example, in terms of the pharmaceuticals, fine chemicals, foodstuffs, while they have astronomically grown in terms of unplanned for, there are other industries, for example, hospitality, construction, which have gone terribly off, and some which have maintained, like agriculture. So therefore, from your product mix, there as it is, there would be huge changes that are going to take place. So therefore, from a capex point of view, your first thing would be look at conserving capital to see what you would like to change, what kind of a configuration change in manufacturing plants and processes you need to do to meet your existing changing profile. I do not see managements hurrying up to look at buying up stressed assets outside because of the capacity that will come, because you also need the people to do it, and in the first 2 or 3 quarters there will be far more focus on consolidation and looking at your internal resources to optimize and be at the best of strength by conserving your capital.
Thanks, Prasad. Bhavna, here's a question addressed to you. It says to Ms. Bhavna Doshi, do you feel in difficult situations like the one we are witnessing right now, governance and compliance may take a backseat for many corporates, as there may be a conflicting situation between meeting the law, governance processes on one hand, and sheer survival on the other. Your views, Bhavna? I think you're muted, Bhavna.
Mute.
Yeah, I don't think governance can ever take a back seat. It will always be there, whatever be the situation you are in, whatever stress you are in, you have to have that as your top item. And in terms of compliances, again, yes, there are, again, it depends on the type of compliance that you're talking about. Some of the compliances we will get some relief. Some compliances you will have to take that liberty that all right, doesn't matter. I will have consequences. I may have some interest. I may have some penalty. Perhaps later on the penalty I can ask for waiver because the situation is such. Interest could be a burden, so people will evaluate it. So compliance may be some areas, but again, not all. So if you're looking at compliances relating to your business, so say if you are in a pharma industry or you are in a R&D sort of setup, obviously the compliances can never take a backseat. It will have to remain in forefront. So again, depends on the nature of compliance that you're talking about, the industry that you're talking about. But governance, I don't think would ever be compromised. At least at the board level, no board member will allow that to happen.
Yeah.
I think that's very heartening to hear, and all of us share that common spirit. Dhanpal, here's a question for you, so you may want to unmute your video and sound. The question goes like this: request you to please talk about some conflicts faced in achieving the sustainability goals in package long-term and short-term, and financial goals long-term and short-term, along with real-life examples. Compromises made under sustainability/financial goals can be highlighted, and how the challenge was faced. Will the scenario improve post-COVID? A pretty long-winded question, but I think what Manish Balwani essentially is asking you, Dhanpal, is can you give some examples of the constant challenges we face on long-term versus short-term, and compromises on sustainability, financial goals versus mission, etc.?
I think one of the most stark examples of conflict is what you've just seen happen recently with a lot of corporations paying huge dividends to their shareholders and at the same time going to the governments of various countries basically with a begging bowl saying that we need support and all kinds of relief, right? This is, in my view, a massive conflict in my mind. The second type of conflicts that I've seen again, which I'm really sometimes shocked, is that some of the largest corporations in this country, right, are basically denying valid payments to their supply chain, or basically delaying it, in the guise of COVID, when they have the ability to withstand and suffer the shock a lot better than most of the ecosystem, right? And I don't know how the boards are behaving and acting and basically allowing management to do these things. We've seen this is, you've got to, as a conscious citizen, take a very strong view, right? Is it me at the cost of anyone else? Or do I at some point in time step back and say, look, let this be for the larger good? And I think this is a massive gray area, because it's a flight and, what we call the fight or fear, instinct, which is there in every human being, right? That the first instinct is to fight, is basically, okay, let's try and grab everything for ourselves. Let's save ourselves, to hell with anyone else. And that's where I think in the long term, people will then start differentiating, right? Whereas who do they really see as people who are thinking about long-term sustainability rather than basically just, short-term kind of approach to doing business.
I think that's very well said, Dhanpal. In this kind of scenario that we are in, every moment in a manager's life is full of conflicting decisions. And as we alluded earlier, if we follow our corporate dharma, I think most things would follow. Bajpai Saab, here's a question for you from Divya Momaya. I think she has heard your opening remarks with great attention. And from that, she's asking your question, can Bajpai sir focus on what are the few things that boards are not supposed to do in times of crisis?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first and foremost, I would recommend the board not to do is procrastination. Rather than thinking of what happened and go on, what we call it paralysis by analysis, we should move forward. Right at this point in time, the most important for all the companies, as Bhavana Ban said, is to make sure that you live tomorrow. So the economic morbidity has to be prevented by the board of the enterprise. And if that is done, then possibly things will happen. The second thing board should not do is to unnecessarily engage themselves on the trivialities. Because what happens, even when we start talking of compliances or we start talking of what is the feature of corporate governance, as Donovan was very articulately outlining, that whereas corporate governance can never take a back seat. But then you can't be indulging into trivialities, oh, whether compliance certificate is filed or not, whether this has been done, rather than spending time on trying to help and guide the management how to handle this unusual situation. I can go on endlessly, and but if there is further any specific question, I would be happy to answer that.
Great. We have a last question. This is to the panel at large. Anyone can pick it up. This is Bimal Bhatt asking, without being purpose driven, how can a company survive in the first place? And the allied question is, if you are not purpose driven, or if you're purpose driven, how do you ensure that there is constant communication with all the stakeholders involved? Any hands up to take this one?
Well, let me just mention one point and then I'll leave it to Bhanaban to answer that.
No, I was saying Bajpai ji can answer this. Perfect.
Okay. Oh, no. My fundamental point is, first and foremost, is that people confuse some kind of a target, like, giving maximum shareholder value is not the purpose of an organization. The purpose of the organization has to be much larger, and that must be able to envelop not only the attention but the commitment of all stakeholders. And therefore, whatever it is, in fact, this is the point which, and Manavan is aware of it because we sit together on a board, that we want to look at what is going to be the vision of this organization. What is that this organization going to pursue? And that cannot be one particular stakeholder's interest. So that's one fundamental question which is very important for the board to look at. And oftentimes what happens, this is whereas the suggestions are most welcome from the management, but it is the board which has to take a call, because it's the board which has to drive the sustainability of the organization. And sustainability of an organization is driven by the purpose and not by one particular. And therefore, when I was mentioning that don't look at only financials, you also look at what is going to happen to the enterprise going forward, how it is going to view. See, look at it. Today, if you don't care of supply chain fellows, tomorrow they are not going to be a part of your association. Today, if you don't take care of employees, no employee would like to work for you. So this is where the issues are, and that's where the board must address this.
Thanks, Mr. Bajpai. Manoj, how are we doing on time? Do we need to wind up, or we have another 5-10 minutes?
No, we are almost at the end of it, 6:28, no?
You can take more 5 minutes, no issues.
Yeah, I think Jambu, you should now just give your perspective, views. We've been discussing about so many things. So I'd like to hear your perspective.
So I think, just to sum up what most of the panelists have said, and my personal perspective as well, having dealt with boards both in executive as well as a non-executive capacity, I think one of the, and taking up from the point which that lady asked as a question, one of the first things I think the biggest favor the board could do to managements today is to be their friendly mentors. can bet you every managing director, every executive director must be under tremendous pressure. I've been there. So boards need to just keep to their fiduciary responsibilities, be good mentors, and not come too much in the way of the executive management. It's going to be really tough times. But having said that, the role which, say, the MD or some of the executive directors perform also becomes very onerous and lonely at times. You're faced with sleepless nights where single decisions can make impact on multiple financial parameters, multiple employee lives. And at that point in time, having a stellar, supportive board again makes a great difference. So again, coming back to this point, I think we have had a scenario in India for a very long time where we have had boards which are very mixed. We have had very enlightened, supportive, transformative boards, and then we have had some boards where, quote unquote, the shadow of the promoter is always lurking. But I think this whole COVID phase would probably lead corporate India into strengthening board practices where they could help executive management perform better. There are going to be challenges, we're going to make challenges on which employees to retain, which employees to promote. How do we recompose our boards? Do we give opportunity to younger, more ambitious people? Or in times like this, go for tried, tested, mature people? These are a lot of questions which executive management and boards are going to face. I think hopefully all of us are only praying for one thing, which is a V-shaped recovery. That we're going down is inevitable. All we can hope for is we get through this fast and we get into V-shaped recovery, and then it's up to us as corporate India to take India forward. I think with that we can kind of wind up. We're at 6:30.
Well, Jagu, can I just make one small point, Jagu?
Can I make one small
point?
Okay. Certainly.
No, Amrita made very, very valid point, and I thought all of us noted that, but maybe it needs some kind of re-emphasis. That it is true that India has been significantly ahead of many geographies in laying down the legislative obligation on the board to treat all the stakeholders equally and be responsible to all of them. But my fundamental approach, and in fact, I was one of those people who are good for it, while the legislation has been doing, because I've been a part of policy making in any case. But the real issue is that you can't change the behavior of the people by just passing a legislation. The behavior of people is motivated by the incentives. And therefore, there has to be an approach by the framework that the people's incentive should be shifting towards giving a particular kind of behavior. And that is where the point I was trying to make, that if people like Larry Fink and people like various other large investors keep saying, hey, if you don't provide egalitarian approach to all the stakeholders, I'm not going to be part of your enterprise. And likewise, there has to be several other movements. And of course, that is here comes the role of the board. And the board, instead of only trying to follow the letters of the law, must work seriously, strongly, and deliver the results of delivering the intention of the law. And if that happens, then only the corporate behavior will change. That is what my point has been. But I do, certainly, as I say, I've been one of those votaries of making all these changes. If somebody may remember, when I used to work for SEBI, sometime in 2004 and 5, I had promoted the thought of not shareholder. In fact, Chris had asked them to prepare a document of very strong and good point.
Thanks, Mr. Bajpai. I think we're very fortunate to have you kind of give your closing remarks for the session and bringing it all together. Thank you, dear panelists. I think this was a wonderful evening spent. I hope all the people who have logged in from all over the country found it value for time. Do keep dropping in your questions or thoughts if you may have any through the organizers, and I can promise you, as we as panelists will try and respond and guide you on anything which we can help you with. Manoj, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have the onerous duty of giving vote of thanks. So let me first and foremost start with all the participants who have joined, not only from India, across the globe, because I could see 4 or 5 participants from out of country. So thank you very much for joining in such a large number. We are really thankful to Mr. G.N. Bajpai ji for his keynote speech, which is not only enlightening, but is kind of showing a roadmap for us. Thankful to Mr. Jangu for so nicely moderating and making the deliberations really interesting, covering most of the aspects the board needs to cover to make it purpose-driven, keeping all the stakeholders in view. Thanks to all the panelists. As Mr. Jangu sir has observed that we had benefits of first 20 minutes of discourse from most experienced Mr. G.N. Bajpai ji, and then we have the panel representing investment banker, auditor, independent director, legal viewpoint, and Mr. Jangu's viewpoint as a consultant for various large boards. So thanks to BCCI for its managing team, its back support team for organizing this online fireside chat series. As you all know, there will be 2 more sessions under this series. We are thankful to West India Regional Council of ICI for agreeing to be a joint organizer. We are thankful to CA Lalit Bajaj, Chairman WRC, for his opening remarks, and CS Murtuza Kachwala, Secretary WRC, for his due support and the role he has played in putting up this series. Thank you, Chartered Accountants Hiral Bhai Shah and Advocate Sejal bin Shah, without whom this webinar could not have been up and running so smoothly. Their technical help made all the panelists comfortable. Special thanks to Mr. Shailesh Haribhakti, who guided us in selecting topics, and some of the panelist speakers. Thank you, Intuit Consulting Private Limited, for joining as a knowledge partner, and Mr. Jangu Dalal and Mr. Bajpai for their guidance and support from time to time. Last but not the least, Team Manoyog GRC Advisors, who has put together the entire concept, theme, and the series. Tomorrow we have our 3rd session in the series on protecting directors from legal liabilities for insolvency, financial defaults, and involuntary financial defaults, and a required change in insolvency and bankruptcy code as defaults propagate. The timings are same, 5 to 6:30 p.m. You may check BCCI website for further details, or you may get mail or WhatsApp message for the registration. Thank you once again. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, panelists, once again from my personal side.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye to all of you. Thank you, Jangu, for doing it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hiral Bhai. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Manu.